Greetings and welcome to your algebra recording for the week of September 5th, which is also week 4. So you will be going into the week 4 folder for your assignments this week. Before we get started and look at some new content that you're going to be learning this week, we are going to review a little bit of what we looked at last week and the week before. You guys are going to be taking a quiz this week, so this warm-up question will be a great review to remind yourself of what you've learned so far and some of the types of questions that you might see on the quiz this week. So the warm-up should be very helpful. I do want you to try the warm-up on your own in your math notebook first. So remember, you guys have the option of clicking on the pause to pause the recording so that you can try this warm-up question and other questions that I do throughout this recording. You always got that option of clicking pause and trying something on your own first. So there are 2 warm-up questions. The first one is you're going to write an inequality based on this graph right here. Remember to pay attention to open and close circles when you're writing your inequality. And then there's a compound inequality for number 2 that you're going to solve. So go ahead and take a moment to try these on your own in your math notebook. And when you're ready to check your work with mine, go ahead and click play. Alrighty, so let's look at number 1. Number 1 is a compound inequality because we've got more than one inequality. We've got this inequality here and this inequality here. So this is a compound inequality because we've got 2 inequalities that are combined. This is going to be a inequality where we're going to use the word or. So first of all, let's start down here. What is this inequality on its own? So we've got numbers that are less than 1. Less than 1. They're not including 1 because it's an open circle. So we can say that x has to be less than 1. Or, what about this inequality on the right side? X has to be what? Greater than or equal, because it's a closed circle, so we're going to include that equal, greater than or equal to 9. So for number 1, it is a compound inequality. I can move that down next to the graph to show what numbers are included on that number line. So it's going to be x is less than 1 or x is greater than or equal to 9. And then we're going to move on to number 2. And number 2 is another compound inequality. There's actually 2 different inequalities here, and I can show you those. The first one being just the 4 is less than x plus 2. So that's one of our inequalities. So let's go ahead and write that over here, that we're going to solve for the inequality that's 4 is less than x plus 2. And because we also have another inequality in there. And the other inequality is the right side, where we've got x plus 2 is less than 8. So actually, let me get rid of that blue in there. And we can just highlight the x plus 2 is less than 8. So that's the other inequality. So there's actually 2 inequalities within that compound inequality. So we can separate it into 2 inequalities. And we want that keyword and to be included. So when we get our answer, we can say x is whatever and x can be this. So let's go ahead and solve. So from this first inequality right here, we're going to solve by subtracting 2 from both sides. And I get 4 minus 2 is less than, or x is greater than 2. So that's one answer. And our second answer, we're going to subtract 2 from both sides. And we get x is less than 8. So the solution is going to be all numbers. So the solution then would be all numbers that are greater than 2 and less than 8. So it would be from between 2 and 8, not including 2 or not including 8 because we don't have that greater than or less than or equal to there. So those are the 2 answers for our warm-up, getting us thinking, reminding yourself about compound inequalities and really inequalities in general. I'm going to move on to the next slide, so if you need more time, go ahead and click pause. So just some quick reminders. I really want us thinking about the Grades tab and making sure that you guys are using all the tools in the Grades tab. So make sure that you're checking your overall grade by clicking on your Grades tab and looking to see how you're doing in the class. And then just some reminders that make sure you're trying to do your best on your first try. You can do this by making sure you practice the practice problems before you attempt a graded assignment. Make sure you're going through all the lessons in order and learning the material before you try an assignment. You can redo assignments, remember, but you can't redo tests and quizzes. And with a quiz coming up this week, I just wanted to remind you about that. You can only redo assignments from the current unit. And then just wanted to point out something from the Grades tab. Your Grades tab can be super helpful in not only seeing what your overall grade is and how you did on each individual assignment, but also using it as a guide to see what you've turned in and if you're missing any assignments. So there's a little, it almost looks like a green puzzle piece with a pencil next to it. If this icon is next to an assignment, that means you submitted it. If there is not this icon next to your assignment, that means you have not yet submitted it. And again, that can serve as a reminder of, oh, I need to get this certain assignment submitted. Make sure that you're clicking on graded assignments to open it up and see what you missed. And then I'm always leaving feedback for you that's going to be helpful when you go to redo an assignment. So make sure you're clicking on your graded work to see what you missed and read my feedback. Whoops. This should not be, hold on. You can ignore that last statement there because that does not pertain to this class. All right, so this week you're going to be taking a quiz. So you're going to start the week by taking a quiz covering sessions 1 through 4. So make sure you take some time to review. I always tell students a great way to review for a quiz is to do any low scoring assignments that come before the quiz or test. That way, not only are you reviewing, but you're also improving on some low scoring assignments. Then we're going to go on to Unit 1, Session 5, where we're going to review solving equations and really focus on justifying our steps that we use when we solve equations. So we're going to be looking at justifying each of our steps with writing in one of the properties of equality, and we'll go over those and in this recording. And then you're going to do Unit 1, Session 6, which is very short, where you're going to be focusing on reasoning with inequalities in the real world. So really you're just going to take what you've learned and apply it to real world situations. All right, so what do I mean by properties of equality? So in Unit 1, Session 5, you're going to be practicing solving equations, so something that you're already familiar with doing where you solve for an equation with a variable. And you're going to be justifying each step. So we're going to take it a step further and we're going to justify each of our steps using inverse operations and properties of equality. So remember, property of equality is when we've got an equal sign and we've got information on both sides of that equal sign. So what are the steps? So let's review. When we've got an equation, let's say we've got an equation like 2x equals 6. And we want to solve for the variable. So here's our steps that we always use when we solve for a variable. So first, we locate the variable that you're trying to solve. So we always look and we say, okay, where's our variable we're trying to solve for? And in this particular equation, our variable would be x. Step 2 is we want to identify the operations on the variable and the order in which they are applied. So really, we want to work on how can we get the variable all alone on one side of the equation, because that's how we solve for it. And in order to get the variable all alone on one side of the equation, we're going to use the inverse operations to undo operations and isolate the variable. So what does that all mean? What does that all mean? Let's move on to the next slide. So what is an inverse operation? I mentioned that we're going to use inverse operations to solve for the variable. And we want to make sure that we understand the vocabulary that we're going to see this week in our lessons. So inverse operations, those are operations that undo one another. So the inverse operation is the operation that reverses the effect of another operation. For example, addition and subtraction are inverse operations. They're the opposite of one another. Where multiplication and division are also opposites of one another, so they're inverse operations. And here's a list just to remind yourself if you need a reminder. Inverse operations, again, are operations that undo one another. They're opposites. So if we have something that's being added, the inverse operation to undo that would be to subtract. If we have something that's being multiplied, the opposite of multiplying is dividing, so we would undo it by dividing. Same with, we can go in the opposite direction. If we have a variable that's being divided by a number, the opposite of dividing would be multiplying. So if we had a variable being divided by a number, we would use multiplication to undo that. And then we've got squares and square roots. Those are opposites of one another. And again, these can work in either direction. If you have a variable that's being subtracted by a number, you would add a number to undo that. And then we've got properties of equality. So I want you to write these down. They're pretty straightforward. So the addition property of equality is when you add the same number to both sides of the equation to solve, then you're using the addition property of equality. So if you're using addition as your inverse operation, you're essentially using the addition property of equality. Whereas the opposite, if you're subtracting the same number from each side of the equation to solve for a variable, you're using the subtraction property of equality. And then the same true over here, multiplicative property of equality. If you have a variable that you're trying to solve for and it involves you multiplying each side of the equation by the same number, then you're using the multiplicative property of equality. And last, we've got the division property of equality. When we're trying to solve an equation and we need to divide a number on both sides of the equation to get that variable all alone, we're using the division property of equality. So we're going to use these 4 properties to justify each step when we're solving for variables this week. And we're going to see some examples. So I'm going to go on right now and we're going to try some examples. Okay, so here we go. We've got an equation, because we have an equal sign, which makes it an equation. We've got x plus 6 equals 10. So let's solve this, and let's get detailed here with how we're solving. So we're going to be very specific and detailed in explaining how we're able to solve. So first of all, what's the variable in this equation? The variable is x. Remember, that's our letter that represents an unknown. What operation is being performed on? What operation is being performed on the variable? So here's our variable x. And x is what's being done to the x. It's being added to. So we've got addition. We're adding to the x. So what is the opposite? It says, what's the inverse operation? So what that's asking is, what's the opposite of adding? Subtraction. So the inverse operation that we're going to use to solve for x in this equation up here is going to be subtraction, correct? Because right now x is being added to, we're adding 6 to it. That's the operation that's being performed. And the inverse operation is what we use to solve for the variable. So the inverse operation is going to be the opposite of adding, which is subtraction. And then that formal property of equality that we use to describe that inverse operation is going to be the, we look back here, the subtraction property. The subtraction property of equality. So let's look at that up here. Let's see that being done. So if we've got our equation x plus 6 equals 10, well, to solve for x is being added right now to, so the opposite of adding is subtracting. So we would subtract from each side to solve, and we would get x equals 4. And we used the subtraction property of equality right here in this step to solve for x. So I'm going to go into the next slide. So if you need more time, go ahead and click pause. So I want you to look at this problem. Same setup. We've got an equation 2x equals 18. And I want you to see if you can go through these same steps that we did on the previous slide and answer each question. So go ahead and click pause and see if you can answer each question on your own. And then when you're ready to check your work with mine, you can click play. All right, so we've got 2x equals 18. What is the variable we're trying to solve for? It's x. What operation is being performed? What operation is being performed on the variable? So right now, it's being multiplied, right? It's being multiplied. Or you could say multiplication. What is the inverse operation then that we're going to use to undo that multiplication? It's division. The opposite of multiplying is dividing. And what do we call that property of equality that we can use to solve for this equation? So what's the more proper term here? It would be the division. Remember right here, the division property of equality. The division property of equality. So to solve this equation, when we've got 2x equals 18, we would divide each side by 2 and get x equals 9. So we use the division property of equality to solve this. We divided each side by 2. Whatever we did to one side, we did to the other. And that's where we get that property of equality, that whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other side. And same with on this previous slide. We subtracted x from both sides of our equation. We kept the equation equal by doing the subtraction from each side. Think of it as like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other to keep it level. All right, so I'm going to go on to the next slide. So if you need more time, you want to take this down in your notes, go ahead and click pause. Otherwise, I'm moving on to the next slide. So now let's just take what we were doing a step further, and we are going to solve this equation, and we're going to write it out step by step. And then for each step, we're going to supply a reason. And the reason is going to be one of our properties of equality. So again, for each step, we're going to supply a reason. And that reason is going to be one of our 4 properties of equality. All right, so are you ready? All right, so we're trying to solve for x. So our first step is we want to remove the 4 from both sides. That's our first step, is we're going to subtract 4 from each side. And when we subtract 4 from each side, which property of equality would that be? That would be the subtraction property of equality. So let's write that in. And after we subtract 4 from each side, now we've got 3x equals 6 remaining. And now what's our next step in solving for x? So our next step is x is, we've got 3 being multiplied by the x. The inverse of multiplying is dividing, so we're going to divide each side by 3. And we get x equals 6 divided by 3 is 2. So that next step where we divided each side by 3, we need to put in a reason for that step because this was our first step and this is our second step. So we divided from each side, so we use the division property of equality. So again, this session, we're really just focusing on supplying reasons for each of our steps when we solve for equations. And the reasons are those properties of equality. Whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. And what did we do to each side? If we subtracted, it's the subtraction property of equality. If we divided by each side, it's the division property of equality. And then we also have the addition and multiplicative property of equality as well. So that's what you're going to do this week in Unit 1, Session 5. So I'm going to wrap up the recording now. I don't want this to get too long. So if you need more time with this slide, go ahead and click pause. Otherwise, I'm going to go to this last slide where our key phrase assignment is. And remember, you need to answer the key phrase question to get your 10 points. And let me put that up. So we talked about using properties of equality to solve equations. And remember thinking of those as the reasons behind each step when we're solving equations. So we've got this equation x minus 4 equals 12. I want you to tell me when you're solving this equation what property of equality is used. So you don't have to tell me what x equals. I want you to tell me which property of equality is used to solve that equation, just like we did in the examples in the recording. And then I've got the directions to complete the key phrase assignment in case you need that reminder. Otherwise, have a fantastic rest of your week, and if you need help with anything, remember I'm here to help.